So welcome everybody to this forum to discuss a resilient water future for our region. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us. We have another person waiting in the room. Before I just want to let people know that we are expecting Uncle Roy Gordon to do a welcome to country, and my plan is that when he arrives, if it's still during this, during my general introduction, I'll pause for that. But when Stuart's presentation, if he comes during Stuart's presentation, I'll let that finish. And then at the end of Stuart's presentation, we'll hand over to the welcome at that point. So Sue Higginson's waiting to come in. This forum is being hosted by the Water Northern Rivers Alliance, and the aim is to bring together decision makers, knowledge experts and interested community to have a respectful conversation across diverse viewpoints. The aim is to listen, learn from others, generate new thinking about this critical issue. So I'll just go and share my screen now and talk a bit about the agenda. That didn't happen.
It's starting now. There we go.
Great. So if you want to see the whole screen, you can always just on the right-hand side, if you've had it on gallery view, you can just press the little minus button on the top right-hand corner and the thumbnail will show the full screen. Okay, so just going straight to the forum agenda. At around 4:10, which is in about 3 minutes, Stuart White will be doing a presentation around different water options, and I'm hoping that people have had a chance to have a look at the brochure that we've summarised some of these options. That'll be followed by a question and answer session, which at this stage we're just going to be getting questions for clarification only. And so what I'd like to do if you have a question, so you can put this up during the presentation or afterwards by using the chat. And so I will be filtering those to just choose questions that are clarification questions only. So if you put the question on the chat, then I will feed those through to Stuart. So questions that we don't get to, we will have a process after the forum of gathering up the questions that didn't get answered, and we will send out a document to all participants which has the questions and answers there. So Stuart will answer those in the time after the forum, because we're not probably going to get a chance to have everybody get their questions asked. So after that, at around about 4:35, we will have breakout groups, and you have facilitators for those breakout groups who will identify themselves once you get in. So these breakout groups will automatically be generated at the time they're scheduled for. And two questions the first question is, what is your vision for the future of water for the ROUS region? That's looking at the broader picture, more values about water. And then based on the kind of different options that Stuart will be talking about and that were in the brochure and is in the all options on the table report that a number of people might have seen, we're going to then have a discussion about what are the most important options that we could be considering for this water future in the 21st century. Then there'll be a report back from facilitators just about what the main things that came out of those groups were, particularly what the main options were that people thought we should be considering, followed by a wrap up and close. So that's the agenda. And so what I'd like to do now is to introduce Professor Stuart White from UTS. I'll now just stop my share. And who has done a lot of work in this area, has done work with ROUS, and is an expert in this field. So we're very lucky to have Stuart as part of our group here today to make that presentation. So welcome, Stuart, over to you. Might need to unmute you. I'll do that.
Thanks very much, Kath, and thanks to the Water Northern Rivers Alliance for the opportunity to speak today, and also congratulations on the work that you've done bringing together a group today and sort of fostering debate about what's a really important issue for any region, but in particular the Northern Rivers region. So the purpose that I have today is really just to seed and prompt the discussion. I mean, I'll be presenting some ideas, some options, but I want to make it really clear that they're just ideas. I've done some preliminary work just to test some of those ideas, but it really has been in the context of a short time of reviewing the documents that have been put forward for the Future Water Strategy and drawing on the experience that I have and that our group has around Australia and internationally. So I want to just talk a little bit about background, what might entail best practice water supply demand planning, which is essentially part of the task of thinking about urban water supply and town water supply, and what might be a sustainable water program. What are the options that are available? And again, I'll stress, this is not a definitive program. There would need to be some thinking, and part of the discussion that you're having today is to actually think about what those options might be out of a whole range of different opportunities. So the first thing I just wanted to provide a bit of background, and as many of you will know, the ROUS region is actually responsible for a lot of really innovative thinking in water efficiency historically. And a lot of the programs that were initiated in ROUS going back to the late 90s were actually used as a template for the Sydney demand management strategy, which was designed to meet operating license targets, and which was then used, and that was in the context of Sydney needing to reduce its demand to meet a target prior to the drought. And then, of course, the drought happened and it became even more important. But then Southeast Queensland picked up on those same methods that Sydney had employed to the tune of many tens, then hundreds of millions of dollars. And Southeast Queensland implemented those in record time in order to reduce the impact of the drought in that region. So, and a lot of that started from ROUS County Council. So in a sense, what we're talking about today is really just picking up on a thread that was started and saying, what would happen if you maxed out on this? What would happen if you implemented a greater level of investment? And indeed, the last drought changed the nature of water supply demand planning in Australia. So people started to think about the fact that it wasn't just supply, it's also demand becomes important, and also started to think about what might contingency options look like. What might emergency implementation of supply side strategies mean? Because indeed, the last drought was in many cases actually an emergency. And we've done work across the world. You can see some representation of that here, including supporting California water utilities, but also back in 1997, I did the work for ROUS, which some of you have seen. I can provide any of this information, by the way, and we can make the PowerPoint available, including the links. So just getting straight into it, what does best practice water supply demand planning mean? And the first thing is to see that it's no longer appropriate or useful for utilities to see themselves as selling a low-cost commodity, which is water. People don't need water the same as people don't need electricity. What they need are the services that those things provide. So in the case of water, they need clean clothes, they need sanitation, they need aesthetically pleasing landscapes. All of these are the services, and how you provide that, in some cases with less water, with more efficient use of water, in some cases even without water, is a key. So the first thing is, and what a lot of our work is, to talk with utilities about how to think differently about what their business actually is. And part of that is to avoid the financial risk, which is a real danger in this context. The second is that you need to understand what the demand is. Part of planning is to say, it's not just about saying, oh, well, this has been the demand historically, we'll extrapolate that with a straight line on semi-log graph paper and we'll build dams and supplies to meet that. It's actually about understanding what people do with your product, which of course is what Coca-Cola does that. People who sell mobile phones do that. They understand what people do with their product in order to then help to determine the best way to provide that service. Considering the full range of supply and demand options. And that's one of the difficulties I see with the current planning strategy, is it hasn't adequately considered the full range of supply and demand options. And today we'll make a start by talking about what some of those might be. And then assess them on an equal basis, because it is identical whether you reduce water systematically and structurally by 1 cubic metre per day or whether you supply it. So we need to recognise that these are equivalent. The real question is, what is the economic cost of that? What is the environmental, what is the social cost of those two different options? So taking into account those different types of cost. And the other thing we need to do is to say, well, there are two different things we're dealing with here. One is, what's the long-term average change in demand, which might be caused by population growth, it might be caused by changes in the way people use water. And then the second thing is, how do we deal with droughts in the context of great uncertainty associated with, of course, or added to by climate change? I mean, climate has always been uncertain, but it's become more uncertain as climate change. And that's recognised in the Future Water Strategy. We have to acknowledge that uncertainty and try and plan in a way that's more resilient to cope with it. So that's this slide shows that idea that we need to consider both the long-term supply-demand planning, which is the long straight line out to 2060, which you've seen in many of the planning documents. But we also need to say, well, what happens if we get a drought that's worse than the worst drought on record? What do we do? I mean, the Northern Rivers has relatively small storages. They can empty quite quickly. So what's our contingency planning? This is a graph which shows the work that we did for the Sydney Metropolitan Water Plan Review in 2006. And the reason I show this graph is just to talk about the quiet achiever. People often accuse me of going on and on ad nauseum about water efficiency. And part of the reason is because it is the largest, quickest, cheapest way to satisfy the supply-demand balance. And you can see that from the graph. And it's one of those things that's very difficult for people to grasp, because it's something that's not there. You can't cut a ribbon. Well, you can actually, but you'd have to cut, tens of thousands of ribbons in order to recognise and acknowledge the role of water efficiency. But it's just that principle of small little things add up to a lot. And in the context of Sydney, it's the largest single contributor to the supply-demand balance, more so than recycling, more so than additional supply, and itself splits up into a whole range of different disaggregated sources of savings, which you can see there. And we've done a lot of work around different places, but generally everywhere we look, we get a similar picture to this. So there's a lot of detail there. And again, I can provide this to people for having a look at their leisure. But the principle is that the efficiency programs have a much, much lower cost almost everywhere we look than the supply options. And you can see that from minimum MWEPs, minimum water efficiency performance standards, domestic retrofit, non-residential programs, business programs, and so on, all a much lower cost than, in this case, there's the Traviston Crossing scheme, which was the dam, many of you recall, in southeast Queensland, which ultimately wasn't proceeded with. So that best practice supply-demand planning has made a significant difference. So we've starting to see this in cities around the world. We're in Sydney, as many of you know, There's been 1 million people added to the population of Sydney, and basically demand has remained flat. This is our quest, but it's also what we observe is that it's very easy to keep demand capped, and then you can go a bit further and reduce it by the improvement of efficiency, by structural changes, by supplying water through recycled water schemes, and so on. And you get this, the litres per person per day increasing typically to the mid-1980s and then decreasing. And that's the aggregate. But the reason why that happens is because of the power of small things. Now, you might think, well, toilets are pretty mundane, but Australia has had a revolution in toilets. So that the change in the stock of dual flush toilets when it was first introduced was a 12 litre, 6 litre. Now they're down to 4.5, 3, and it hasn't stopped there. That will decrease over time. And as they get changed out, or in some cases, as we incentivize people to change them out, you can see the stock change, so that we will never use as much water to flush toilets in Australia as we did in the early 1990s. So this is a massive change. I mean, the difference between an old single flush toilet and a modern 4.5, 3 is something like over 80% reduction. And you multiply that by washing machines, you multiply it by dishwashers, you multiply it by showers, cooling towers, urinals, industrial processes, irrigation. The story is the same. All you need to do is make the investment. If you invest in the efficiency, you will get these structural savings. We've measured them and so on. So that's all very well about efficiency, and I won't talk about it so much now. I think many of you have read some of the material and have seen that message pretty clearly. But I just did want to put this slide up, even though, again, it's a little bit complicated, but it shows that we're also in a time of transition for the entire water system itself. If you look back to the early 1800s, the cities of the world, towns of the world before they had sewers, they were unmanaged, decentralized, and then we built the sewers of the world and the large dams to provide water. Interestingly, we provided the sewers and the sewage system was provided to reduce the incidence of cholera. Water supply systems were introduced to reduce the risk of fire, and the drainage system obviously to reduce the risk of flooding. So that's the human water system. And then we realized that it caused pollution and caused a whole lot of other things. So we added on these extra bits to try and clean up the sewage and provide more water, desalination plants and the like. But what we're seeing emerging is a different way of thinking, more efficient, decentralized systems, integrated systems. So we're starting to see integration. So where we're using recycled water, so integrating the wastewater system into the water system with high quality purified water. We're starting to see the use of stormwater and rainwater and so on. So this is a change which we need to recognize over time, and it's partly a change driven by the economics and the risk. So I just wanted to end by talking about what could be, what might be the elements of a sustainable water program. This is based both on our experience around the world, but it's also based on the knowledge from the work that was done in ROUS originally. Of course, things have changed a lot since then, but they're pretty common elements that would need to be put in place. And the first is an observation that when you have a county council, which is made up of 4 constituent councils, part of the first challenge is to get regional cooperation. And I do think that's been a barrier to the implementation of some of these things. And I think it's something that would need to be solved in order to implement these things. It would certainly need to be solved to build a $150 million dam. So there's no reason why it couldn't also be solved to spend a lot less money to achieve a greater level of supply-demand balance and reduced risk. So the regional cooperation is absolutely important, and it's an issue that would need to be solved with all the councils and the county council working together. Community engagement is extremely important, not just to bring the community along with whatever the plan might be, but to also understand what the level of service that the community is interested in, because it makes a massive difference in the need for the dam, whether or not you have the different level of restrictions regime that you assume that the community is prepared to accept. And there's not been a satisfactory process of asking the community whether they're prepared to accept, in the jargon, a 5-10-10 rule or a 5-10-15 rule in terms of the depth and frequency of restrictions. So this is extremely important, both in the level of service, but also in terms of what kind of options people are prepared to pay for. After all, if there's a significant expenditure from a monopoly service provider, it behoves the utility to find out what the community's preferences are for the expenditure of those monies. So, and that of course relates to water pricing reform and making sure that you've got the right price that reflects the marginal cost as well, and consistency and appropriate communication across the region. Regulatory reform to make sure that new houses, new dwellings, new businesses have all got appropriate and efficient use of water. Modernising water metering so that, I mean, particularly in the ROUS context, where there are a lot of rural customers where there are significant leaks because there are long runs, and they should all have smart meters so that you can tell if there's a leak and you can support people in their use of water. Measuring end use demand is incredibly important. I mean, my work that some of you will have seen, which has a preliminary estimate of what the efficiency gains might be and what the cost would be, is dependent upon information which we're using from other parts of Australia. So we need to understand how people use water, what the level of efficiency of appliances is across the whole range. Otherwise, it's really difficult to plan and estimate and indeed to do good demand forecasting. So the other element would be a significant marketing and communication program, which costs $1 million a year rather than tens of thousands of dollars a year. And then of course, all of that would need to be managed. Now, what I've done here is list in summary form, and some of you will have seen more detail, and in the brochure you can link through to references with more detail about these. But basically you look at all of the major sectors, all the major end users, implement programs that have been tried and tested in a whole variety of places around the world. In many cases actually measured, the savings have been measured, which relate to residential water efficiency appliances, outdoor water use, relate to business customers, so cooling towers, cleaning processes, wash down, etc. Leakage and pressure management. So what I've done in the preliminary modelling is I've just used an estimate of what Sydney Water has spent and said, what if that was scaled up in terms of a litres per connection or dollars per connection. And recycled water, the potential for both non-potable and ultimately indirect potable reuse in the Northern Rivers region is significant. And I think there's a lot more work that would need to be done for that. And there's some people who have done some analysis and estimates. It's very site specific, so it's impossible to make general statements about it, but there is significant opportunities across the Northern Rivers. It rains a lot in the Northern Rivers, as everyone knows. So the opportunity for stormwater and roof water harvesting, and you will find that a lot of times the catchments are not correlated. So you can actually get some significant benefits from large scale stormwater and rainwater harvesting, particularly on the shoulder period before and after droughts, which has a significant benefit in terms of securing water in the dams. And there are some really good examples that people have pointed to with the warnable roof water harvesting option. Groundwater is significant. Obviously, there are limits to the ability to tap into groundwater, but it's particularly useful as a contingency option if there were an emergency requirement. And the same with intercatchment transfers. There are opportunities. A lot of the costing has been done for the future water strategy based on the idea that you would implement these things preemptively, whereas what has not been done is to say, how could we use some of these in a so-called contingency or real options approach, where you only build it if you need to in an emergency, but you do all the planning for it prior to that. So again, a large range of issues that haven't necessarily been fully investigated. And so here I've just got, some of you will have seen this data. I stress this is based on a preliminary analysis from our experience elsewhere. It's literally a day's work. It's not definitive because we do not have the data to prove up the resource in terms of water conservation, but it's indicative and it's there as a case, if you will, a case to answer. But essentially the level of uncertainty and the closeness of the demand and supply suggests that it would not take much to reduce demand sufficiently to extend the time of the need for augmentation, compared to the yellow line, which is to build a very large supply at great financial cost, most of which will not be needed for many, many years, which of course increases the unit cost of water and is a significant financial risk. And here a similar representation of the delayed opportunities. So just to conclude, and I know this has been a pretty quick Cook's tour of the principles of supply demand planning, but the issue is about risk and uncertainty. I mean, there are obviously we've added the overlay of the climate risk and the uncertainty, which, as I say, it was always there, it's just got worse. We've got the risk associated with large single capital cost investments. And you've got the uncertainty about what demand will do, just what population growth will do and so on. It could go up or down. We don't know. I mean, COVID obviously will have some sort of an impact in ways that we can't necessarily predict. So what are the ways to reduce that financial risk? What are the antidotes to uncertainty? Well, the first one is to diversify your portfolio, have lower risk, low cost, rapidly implementable portfolios, no regrets options, if you will. To have contingency options that you can roll out quickly in a drought. So that's important. It's got to be considered. To get improved data and information, to understand how people use water, to understand how many top loading washing machines there are in the region. Do we know? If we don't, we need to know. That kind of level of detail. How many cooling towers don't have controllers, etc. And to engage citizens, both in terms of to determine their preferences with respect to restrictions, which makes a massive difference to when the dam is needed, just that one factor alone. And secondly, how citizens would prefer their money to be spent in terms of the different options. And one of the other things is that an opportunity to implement an economically beneficial strategy by investing directly in businesses, directly in households, to improve the way with which they use water and the cost of both the water itself, but also the energy that it uses to heat water. In some businesses, the materials that are used. So we've got a lot of evidence that improving the water efficiency in businesses is one of the best ways to keep business in business, because it actually doesn't just save water, it saves energy, it saves materials, it saves processes, would be a significant economic boost at lower cost. So that's another side benefit which needs to be factored into this thinking. And again, apologies for the fact that this was a rapid Cook's tour, but obviously happy to provide this, both the papers that are behind this, but also answer any questions. Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Stuart. Do you want to just stop your share? Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Stuart, for that presentation. It was a lot to absorb, but hopefully the messages have been clear. Now, I haven't seen any questions coming through on the on the chat, but if you want to ask a question, could you just write down, I'd like to ask a question, then I'll hand over to you to ask that question. So I can't necessarily, I can't see everyone at once, so I can't always see that. So if you just have a question you'd like to ask Stuart, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Just indicate in the chat to me, just down the bottom, just kind of open up the chat and saying, I'd like to ask a question, and I can see who that is. Okay, nothing coming through as yet from questions. I think that's interesting. Yes, okay, Jim Jim Richardson, go right ahead, and then Annie. Oh, so Annie came first. Annie Keir wants to ask a question. Oh.
Stuart, I'm wondering if you could explain contingency planning. Like, how can we, if a drought arrives, and the last drought was quite sudden in onset, it seemed to me, how can we get that kind of stuff that you mentioned underway? Like, how does it actually work? What does real options mean?
Thanks, Annie. That's a good question. So, I mean, the first thing is that the best an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Firstly, so what I'm saying presupposes that you've already done as much as you can within the time available before that next drought to implement some of the no regrets options that I was also talking about. So you've done the water efficiency, you've reduced the demand for water in the most cost-effective ways by putting in place all of those things which are currently cost-effective. So the kind of program that I'm talking about and have roughly modelled. That's the first thing. The second thing is to then do the planning for those things which you don't necessarily want to build preemptively because they're too expensive and much more expensive than say the water efficiency or the low-cost recycling and so on. But you plan for them and you do all of the preparation for them so that you can implement them as quickly as possible. For example, West Byron treatment plant might be an opportunity to consider how would you upgrade the level of treatment there in order to do indirect potable reuse. And there are some people based in the Northern Rivers who did a submission on the future water strategy who actually modelled how much it would cost to do indirect potable reuse by taking water from West Byron, treating it to a sufficiently high standard and then piping it so that that could actually go back into the river system and go down and ultimately be pumped up to Rocky Creek. That's an example. And that might be something that might not be cost effective to do preemptively, but it might be something you could do quickly enough if you could see that there was likely to be a problem in future. The same with groundwater options. They're things that could be planned for and then rolled out quite quickly if there was a serious drought. Now, every region is different.
Stu, just to pause you there, I've got 3 more people who'd like to ask questions. So I've got Duncan Day, Jim Richardson and Douglas Tate. So maybe just take those 3 quickly. And just a quick, I mean, I know none of these answers can be quick, but, you know, just to keep that in mind. So Duncan.
Yeah, g'day Stuart, and thanks for the talk.
Hi.
Hey, just a really quick one. It's a minor point, but I think one of the special things about our region here is that interspersed and good friends with all of the people who live in urban areas connected to ROUS are a whole lot of people who aren't connected to ROUS, who all have their own water supply experience. And I just think that that should be measured and included in the mix. So as a question of service, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that a lot of, I mean, when some tanks ran out, people were able to tap into the supply system, and this was often considered to be a weakness. But in fact, it was my understanding is, and this would need to be looked at more carefully, but that it was a relatively small proportion of the water supply that was required during the drought to supply people who were off scheme. And you know, it's quite a legitimate use for scheme water to top up people who are on their own system. Obviously, it's better if they've got larger storages and don't run out of water themselves, but it's something that needs to be factored in.
Thanks, Stu. Jim, a quick one.
Yeah, hi, Stuart. Just thinking back to Annie's questions around real options planning, and I noticed that you didn't have desal in that list that you had up there. Do you see sort of scalable desal as a possibility for real options planning? I know it could be expensive, but on the other hand, it could be sustainably powered in an emergency. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, Jim. It's a very key real options opportunity, and indeed it was the example the one that we did for the New South Wales government at the time was to look at desal for real option or contingency option for Sydney. There's a long story there, but and indeed the Hunter have looked at small scale containerized desal plants on the waterfront as well. So it's not out of the question at all. Things would have to get pretty serious for that to stack up financially. So you'd probably would look at another bunch of options first, but technically, yes, no problem at all.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so a quick one from you, Douglas.
Thanks, Stuart. Look, just, looking at the modelling you provided, and it seems like just a really obvious no-brainer that there's better ways to supply water. And you're doing that in a day on the back of an envelope. What do you see as the biggest impediments to, or the obstacles for, I guess, the wise use of water rather than let's just put it in another big dam?
Yeah, there's a whole economic thesis in why people don't choose the cheapest option, because a lot of the programs that we implement are really just providing incentives for people to do things that it's in their own interests to do anyway, whether they're businesses or whatever. And I was involved in audits of 20 or 30 businesses in the Northern Rivers region some years ago, and a lot of the reasons were people said, "Oh, look, I just don't have the capital," or water bills are such a small part of what I worry about. I'm worried about wages, electricity, whatever. Or they say, "Oh, I'll have to ask head office," or we're not ready to replace that equipment yet. So there's a lot of economic and quite reasonable justifications for people not to implement these things, which is precisely why we say, okay, let's just buy those savings. We're going to buy a dam anyway for 150 million. Why don't we buy these savings for 30 million? So you can overcome the economic barriers, which are, as I say, the multiplicity of reasons for that, and it just costs you. So it's a very simple equation. But there's an institutional barrier as well, which I think is partly what you're alluding to, which is that it's not part of the toolbox of utilities and governments until things get really in strife. And that's what we've seen around the country: operating license targets, severe drought. Then we find suddenly there's a strong willingness to invest in water efficiency. And the other thing is state government has a responsibility, because they do invest in supporting the capital cost, but we need to persuade state governments that they can also invest in those things which reduce the need for capital cost, and that's a barrier yet to fall.
Stu, I've got a question here from Austin Curtin. Has anyone done any work costing costs to consumers for smart taps, efficient toilets, smart meters, etc.? Is this a cost passed on to the end user? Also, did you say ROUS could invest $1 million a year into a marketing, promotion, education program? Do they have the resources to do that? So there's just the first one about costing, what the cost to the consumer is of water efficient measures, and then what about that marketing thing?
Yeah, the cost, it's a really good question. The costs, when we do the costing of water efficiency programs, we count the costs both to the utility or to government or whoever else is paying, as well as the residual cost to the consumer. So you might have a program which says we will provide, say, $100 towards the cost of retrofitting a dual flush toilet, but we expect the customer to match that with $100 or so. And it depends on the design, and you set that set point depending on how many people you want to attract to the program, because the more you pay, the more people will be attracted to the program. There are advantages in not making things completely free, because then it reduces the incentive for people to take ownership of it. But we count the total cost anyway. So in a sense, that doesn't matter in the equation and the comparison of costs. But it all gets passed on to the consumer. Like I say, $150 million dam, the cost will get passed on to the consumer, and it'll be a significant cost. The same. So if you only spend $30 million because you're spending it on things which are much cheaper to achieve the same impact, then you'll be passing on a lower cost to the consumer. So it's that simple. It's just an equation, a comparison of different costs. The second part of the question, I forgot.
It was about, did you say that ROUS could invest $1 million a year into a marketing promotion?
Oh, yeah. I can't remember in my from the spreadsheet what I assumed, but it was something of that order, because you really need to, if you were to run a program where you're offering things to businesses, you're offering things to households, and you're trying to hoover up people, make them an offer that they can't refuse, and get a large percentage of the population, as distinct from sort of the 5% which you might get with a smaller campaign, then you probably need to spend about that much. And I think it was probably $500,000 or so that I put in the estimate, but it depends on how you spend it, and media is cheaper in regional areas, so that's a good thing.
So just one last question from Bobby, just a quick one, Bobby, because we need to move into groups in a minute. Thank you.
Sorry, I was unmuted. Okay. You may have answered this, Stu, but I was thinking about distributed water catchments right across the region, because during the last drought and bushfire up near Rosebank, saw the fireys trying to refill from one of the last pools in what would have been Cooper's Creek, I guess. Seems to me there's lots of opportunities for mini storages right across the region that would be filled during, plentiful water times and held for droughts, and could be used for emergencies like fires and things that are more accessible.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Bobby. And I think there are significant opportunities. When I did the original study, and I also did some work in Lower Clarence, we looked at new subdivisions providing a large proportion, if not all, of their what would be required to have a brand new subdivision, greenfield, to use roof water harvesting and stormwater harvesting to satisfy their own water needs. And in which case you would have to build in the fire protection element. Like I say, in the 1800s, the reason why centralised water supply systems were developed in order for fire protection and pressurised water. So you'd need to actually provide that. So I think there is an opportunity for that. It's very site specific. So you'd have to say, well, what's the lay of the land and so on. And the Warrnambool roof water example is a case in point. It's quite specific to their geography, but there would be plenty of opportunities, particularly with the new growth near Ballina.
Thanks, Stu, and thanks for those great questions. I think that's covered a huge amount of questions that other people might want to ask as well. And just a reminder that the brochure does have kind of more information about some of those roof water harvesting and some of these other methods. So we're now going to ask our wonderful IT person to put us into groups. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good time in the groups. I have got one new message. I'll just have to quick look at that. Oh, shout out to Dean. You are awesome. Thank you, says Sue Higginson.
Thank you, Sue.
Yes, I think he's awesome too. I've only just met him, but he's my hero.
I don't know what we do without him.
No, what will we do without him? Okay, so we'll now start with facilitator report backs. So again, we'll probably just about a minute each, just to summarise what happened. And Valerie, seeing you're closest to me, I will ask you to be the first to report back.
Oh, fabulous. Look, we had this wonderful little group, had Nan in it, Michael, and I have to go into the next, Leslie, I think, sorry. And so basically, we had all sorts of wonderful visions around regional cooperation, increasing efficiency of use, living within respect for natural systems, and a range of visions like that. I'll focus on our top three options. The first one did talk to regional cooperation, and we really looked into some of those levers that currently exist. So it was we particularly looked at the service level agreements that exist at the moment between ROUS County Council and their local governments, that they're currently very transactional, and we could really look at making those strategic to really put in those and coordinated, and that would really make a huge difference to what was attempting to be achieved in a common way. We also spoke there about actually a major rethink about the direction of how those that regional cooperation works. Secondly, we looked at sustainable use and particularly demand management or change, which a really key lever there was cost and pricing. And so if there was accurate pricing that reflected use, that would actually be, quote unquote, a key driver to consumer change. And third, we looked at reducing demand, such as fixing the leaks, the stormwater reuse, the recycling and potable reuse and desalination. So I think I've stuck within my minute and hopefully.
You've done very well. Thank you. Now, Valerie has set the bar, so just follow that model. Okay, so Tom, next.
Sure. Okay. A common theme in the group I was facilitating was long-term social and environmentally sustainable supply of water. It had to meet not only financial criteria, but social and environmental criteria. And related to that was a lot more community engagement and a decision-making process that wasn't enforced from the top down via ROUS and others, and was more locally democratic in its operation. So that's, and there was, related to that were calls for more transparency and accountability for ROUS, from ROUS in terms of the decision-making and how that all went. Yeah, in terms of the top three options, one person came up with doing a full audit of what we've got now so that we can refit appropriately, because if you don't measure what we've got, how can we fit it? And related to that was there's inconsistency in how measurement of water use and leaks is done across the 4 LGAs. And so agreeing on a consistent approach to that would mean we could compare apples with apples and cooperate more effectively.
Just another couple of seconds.
Okay. Yeah, so, and there were no dammed options recommended in the top 3. And so they were all around either decision-making, more locally democratic and community engaged, and science-based options like the water efficiency and demand management that we've been hearing about today.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Wonderful. Terry.
Hi, all. So I had Ros, Vanessa and Jenna in our group. Lovely to have a conversation. So around the vision, we talked about the focus on water security and alongside water quality and confidence in those two things for the population, and that happening in a more decentralized way. And that the focus, there seems like there's been a lot of focus on just increasing supply and wanting to increase the focus on the demand side or the efficiency side around that balance. Also a vision just to really stay open to the various options. For government bodies to be working together, that cooperative thing was a theme as well. And also there was a vision around, tanks and, kind of increased personal responsibility around water as well. Mm-hmm. And then the second question around the top 3 things, water efficiency and decreasing waste was very much a top one for one of the people. Rainwater tanks and really decentralized supply was sort of the number 1 for another person. And just continuing to stay open to exploring the many options and keeping that broad portfolio kind of really open. And yeah, we obviously had more discussions around the different options, but we didn't really come to a sort of 1, 2, 3. Mm-hmm.
Great.
But yeah, the big ones were reuse, water efficiency, rain tanks, and just staying open to the options.
Thanks, Terry. That's really good. I think, Steve, you're next.
Okay. So in our group, we had councillors from both Byron Shire and Richmond Valley in Casino, a landowner who will likely be impacted, their land will be impacted by the proposed dam, and also an environmental lawyer. So in terms of our vision, some of the main points were that our region, we've been trailblazers in the past with environmental and sustainable technologies such as rooftop solar. Why can't we be so again with water management? So join the innovators and lead from the front. Our vision was to have water security for humans and non-humans, being the ecosystem, and to reclaim what water security looks like and not just allow it to be driven by a regional body, but to bring it to a local level. Another vision was to really look hard at industry, and a couple of abattoirs in our catchment are the biggest users of water. So to really look hard at that and say, well, does it have to be that way? And can't we really address the huge consumption in industry? Another vision was to look at, in terms of, retrofitting a rainwater tank can cost, say, between $5,000 and $8,000, but the individual has to outlay that and then wait for any kind of rebate that might be offered, which takes time. So surely in the world of retail, you can buy a pair of shoes online or a garment or even expensive items and pay them off over time. Why can't we do that with water? And education was certainly a big theme that, many people in the country have lived on tank water for decades and understand how precious water is. And so much of our population now being urbanised doesn't understand how precious water is. So just that education from early. So our big themes in terms of our number ones were reuse and recycling, education from early around conservation and consumption, water harvesting, including tanks and stormwater catchment, and emphasis on environmental flows.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. We're probably just going to have to be a little bit more snappy from our reports at this moment. So Bianca. Might just need to unmute.
Hello. So in our group, we had Peter and Kevin. The vision included the uncertainty of climate change and that leaning even more toward ecological sustainability and justice, in fact, to preserve the integrity of ecologies, including social justice, to respect traditional owners and their connection to country, bearing in mind that to prove connection to country, we've also got to, in native title, there are some contradictions there when we've had systematic displacement. Among the options, we had, of course, reducing demand, so echoing many of the other points from the other groups, reducing demand through education, and not only education, but empowerment. For example, what if there was a system of credit points? So if someone was, found to be saving a certain amount of water, a bit like contributing power back to the grid through solar panels, maybe you could, get so many points and then, a free front loader washing machine or something like that. And then just one more point there was also identifying, supporting and promoting examples such as stormwater harvesting and those kinds of
Thanks, Bianca.
Supply options.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, going over to the next page. Our next facilitator is Bobby. Just a quick one, Bobby.
Yep, hi. I won't repeat a lot of things because demand management, including all the appropriate metering on all the information, data gathering, right down to whether water's going to residential or business, is obviously necessary to support demand management. So that came across as a big one, as did of having diversified supply and storage, which leading to water security. That it seems silly to put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, and we do need for security, water security, to have much more diversified supply. And then we also talked about not reinventing wheels, but working on other studies that have been done. Duncan had been on, actually on ROUS County Council, sorry, had Greg, Duncan, Caroline and Jim in my group. It was also about looking at how ROUS works, digging out all the old studies, of which there have been plenty, and I'm sure Stuart's more than aware of those, out of the, the archives, and going back to those, but looking also at how ROUS County Council works in itself, because there is problems with how people with expertise communicate with the councillors. Not all the information's getting through. There was a suggestion specifically of capping a certain amount for each council, and then if they want more or they want to expand, they could just work out how to do it themselves, which is of course possible through many different ways.
Just one more thing quickly.
Maybe ROUS County Council isn't the only problem, but it all has to be connected up with where's their money coming from for actually subsidising a lot of the in-house, in-home things. But there's a bit more, but I could send that on.
Great. Yes, we'll collect all this up. That's great. Dave, just a quick summary.
Okay, just to be very quick, in a way, we didn't focus on those particular kind of options that that were in the brochure. One way to summarise what came out of the discussion, which was with Austin and John and Jill, was wanting to expand what the question is in the first place. So one example was just a sense of that a dam is all the eggs in one basket kind of problem. Let's have more options involved and be thinking about demand as well as supply. But then also a particular concern about flood mitigation in this area, which isn't been talked about as any of this, but it's all still about managing water. And how could that, if we were going to spend a lot of money on water infrastructure, could that also be thinking about flood mitigation as well as drought resilience and supply and so on? And then stepping out from even that to be thinking not just about the economic issues and the water supply and demand issues, but be thinking about community well-being and environmental well-being, so that we have the independence to be looking after our own water in the ways that we want to, if we want to be growing veggies and so on. So there were a whole lot of different interesting things that were really ended up wanting to bring the question out to be bigger.
Right.
And wondering whether ROUS isn't really in a position to manage that. So somebody else needs to be doing it.
Yeah. Great point. Thanks so much, Dave. Katrina.
Right. Okay, well, we were talking about a lot of the same options, but one thing that hasn't been mentioned with system-wide water efficiency, the potential for job creation, and Hannah was from TAFE, and we were discussing the potential for training people up specifically to be engaged in water efficiency measures throughout the Shire. So there's multiple benefits there. We were particularly inspired by the stormwater harvesting and local recycling, particularly at new housing developments, because they're the thing that's driving a lot of the demand. And we had Lee Davison in our group, and unfortunately he was stuck on mute, but we intuited he would be proposing composting and urine diverting toilets, and that's an option that hasn't been mentioned, and a really important one because there's heaps of potential there for cultural change and a hell of a lot of water saving. So that should be in the mix. And Annie mentioned she was very impressed with the all options on the table report from the Water Services Australia, and a report that really encouraged people to read because there's a lot of very good information there. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you for that great report, everybody. It sounds like you've had such good conversations in this very truncated time, and thank you so much for your time. So I'll just quickly just share my screen again quickly for this final slide. So just letting you know that, and I do again want to just say fantastic, and I really appreciate the work the facilitators have done. I'd really like to acknowledge Dean's work as well, and Stuart. but also just remembering that it is NAIDOC week, and because we didn't have a welcome to country, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Bundjalung Nation, and want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and for thanking them for their incredible caretaking of this land, this beautiful country that we live on for thousands of generations. So you can find more information about on the waternorthernrivers.org website. That is actually a very, that's only just been put up in the last couple of days, and a whole lot of information is there. It's a very good sort of go-to site for all this sort of work that we've been talking about today. And just to let you know that we'll be sending out a survey to get feedback on the forum in the next couple of days. And there will be space to actually, if there's still some questions that you'd like answered, we'll also give some space in that survey for those questions to be answered, and Stuart will respond to those. And again, we'll anything that hasn't been answered yet, we can get up on the we can send around to people. So keep an eye out for that survey. And so I'll just like to say thank you to everybody for your contributions. I must say it was great listening to all the sort of things that were talked about, and there's a kind of there were definitely themes, but also lots of really interesting different ideas. So thank you so much, and for everyone who's contributed. Okay, we'll see you all again soon, hopefully.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kath.
Thanks, Kath.
Many thanks.
Well done, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thanks,
But
Kath,
all
and
awesome.
everyone.
Everybody's awesome.